I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The drawing room of Thornfield House possessed the sort of dignified tranquility that comes only with generations of accumulated wealth and impeccable taste. Persian carpets, muffled footsteps, oil paintings of distinguished ancestors gazed down with painted severity, and the morning light filtered through tall windows to illuminate furniture that had been crafted by masters long dead. It was precisely the sort of room where one expected to find elderly gentlemen reading the Times over breakfast, not sprawled in death with expressions that defied both nature and propriety. Sir Reginald Thornfield lay in his favourite leather armchair, positioned as always to command a view of both the garden and the room's entrance. His morning coat was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly groomed, and his hands folded with the precise arrangement that spoke of a man accustomed to controlling every detail of his appearance. The crystal tumbler beside him still held a measure of his customary morning brandy, and the financial papers scattered across the adjacent table suggested he had been conducting business as usual when death claimed him. Yet it was not the peaceful nature of his passing that had reduced the household staff to whispered conferences and anxious glances, but rather the expression that death had chosen to preserve upon his features. Sir Reginald was smiling. It was not the gentle repose that sometimes graces the departed, nor the subtle relaxation of facial muscles that morticians work to achieve. This was a deliberate, conscious smile of unmistakable satisfaction, as though the old gentleman had received news of exceptional good fortune in his final moments. The effect was deeply unsettling, for Sir Reginald Thornfield had not been known to smile with such genuine pleasure during the final years of his life. Indeed, those who knew him best would have testified that he approached each day with the grim determination of a general reviewing disappointing battle reports. The discovery had been made by Pemberton, the butler, whose 40 years of service had prepared him for many domestic crises, but not for finding his master apparently delighted by his own demise. The local physician, Dr. Hartwell, had been summoned immediately and pronounced the death natural, attributing it to the heart condition that had plagued Sir Reginald for several years. Yet even Dr. Hartwell had paused when confronted with that incongruous expression of contentment, adjusting his spectacles twice before making his official pronouncement. The timing of Sir Reginald's death was particularly unfortunate, as Thornfield House was hosting what the family had termed a reconciliation weekend. The old gentleman had summoned his relatives and closest associates for what he had mysteriously described as the settling of old accounts and the arrangement of future harmonies. The guests, who had arrived the previous evening amid considerable speculation about their host's intentions, now found themselves trapped by both circumstance and a sudden autumn storm that had rendered the country roads impassable. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the deceased's wife of 35 years, received the news with a composure that had made her a formidable figure in London society. She was a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of her husband's moods with diplomatic skill, yet even she seemed puzzled by the expression that death had chosen to preserve. "Reginald was many things," she confided to Dr. Hartwell, "but he was never given to inappropriate displays of emotion. This smile troubles me more than I can adequately express." The other guests presented a curious gallery of potential beneficiaries and long-standing grievances. Mr. Geoffrey Thornfield, Sir Reginald's younger brother, had arrived from his modest cottage in Devon with the eager anticipation of a man whose financial circumstances had grown increasingly precarious. His relationship with his elder brother had been strained for decades, ever since a business disagreement that had cost Geoffrey both his fortune and his place in the family firm. Yet he possessed the sort of desperate charm that made him difficult to dismiss entirely, and Sir Reginald had recently begun including him in family gatherings after years of calculated exclusion. Miss Cordelia Thornfield, Sir Reginald's unmarried daughter, had inherited her father's sharp intelligence and her mother's diplomatic instincts, yet she remained financially dependent despite her 32 years. She served as her father's unofficial secretary, and had become privy to many of his business dealings, a position that granted her considerable knowledge while maintaining her subordinate status. Her relationship with her father had grown increasingly complex as she approached an age when spinsterhood became a permanent rather than temporary condition. The Reverend Dr. James Ashworth represented the family's connection to respectability and moral authority. As Sir Reginald's nephew and the rector of the local parish, he had maintained a careful balance between spiritual guidance and practical dependence upon his uncle's generosity. His recent appointment to a prestigious living had been secured through Sir Reginald's influence, creating obligations that weighed heavily upon his conscience. Dr. Ashworth possessed the sort of refined features and gentle manner that made him universally trusted, yet those who observed closely might have noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he spoke of his uncle's business affairs. Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne, Sir Reginald's widowed sister, had arrived from London with her usual complement of grievances and expectations. Her late husband's debts had left her in reduced circumstances, and she had developed the particular skill of presenting financial difficulties as temporary inconveniences rather than permanent conditions. She possessed a sharp wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of family secrets, making her both a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy, depending upon the circumstances. The final member of the gathering was Mr. Edmund Blackwood, Sir Reginald's solicitor and oldest friend. Their association stretched back to their university days, and Blackwood had handled the family's legal affairs for over 3 decades. He was a man of impeccable discretion and professional competence, yet recent months had brought subtle changes in his relationship with Sir Reginald. Those who observed their interactions carefully might have detected an undercurrent of tension that suggested professional disagreements or personal conflicts. As the storm continued to rage outside and the roads remained impassable, the assembled company found themselves confined with both a mystery and their own uncomfortable speculations. Sir Reginald's smile seemed to mock their uncertainty, suggesting that he had arranged one final surprise for those who had thought they understood him. The drawing-room, usually a sanctuary of civilized discourse, had become a stage where each guest played their role while wondering what secrets the others might be concealing. It was into this atmosphere of genteel suspicion and barely contained anxiety that word arrived of an even more disturbing development. Pemberton, conducting his usual morning inventory of the household silver, discovered that Sir Reginald's prized possession, a medieval chalice that had belonged to the family for centuries, was missing from its customary place in the library. The chalice, worth considerably more than its weight in gold due to its historical significance, had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only the faint outline of its base in the dust of the shelf where it had rested for decades. The theft transformed an already unsettling situation into something approaching genuine alarm. If Sir Reginald had died of natural causes while contemplating some private satisfaction, that was merely puzzling. But if his death was connected to the disappearance of the family's most valuable heirloom, then the mysterious smile took on an entirely different significance. Perhaps Sir Reginald had not been pleased by good fortune, but had instead been savoring some final triumph over those who had underestimated his cunning. As the guests gathered for a subdued luncheon, each face bore the careful neutrality of people who suspected they were being observed and judged. The storm showed no signs of abating, the roads remained impassable, and somewhere in the house, a medieval chalice worth a small fortune had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Sir Reginald's smile, preserved in death, seemed to suggest that he had orchestrated these final complications with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire life. The stage was set for revelations that would test the bonds of family loyalty and expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. In such circumstances, it seemed almost inevitable that someone would suggest summoning the one man in London whose reputation for unraveling impossible mysteries was matched only by his legendary precision in matters of human psychology and criminal deduction. The decision came to Lady Margaret with the clarity that accompanies moments of genuine crisis. As the subdued luncheon dissolved into uncomfortable silences and meaningful glances, she set down her teacup with the decisive gesture of a woman accustomed to taking charge when circumstances demanded action. "We cannot simply wait for the roads to clear," she announced, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a formidable hostess for 3 decades. "The disappearance of the chalice changes everything entirely. If there has been theft alongside death, we require more than the local constabulary can provide, regardless of the weather." Mr. Blackwood, the family solicitor, cleared his throat with the measured deliberation that preceded his most carefully considered statements. "There is, perhaps, one man whose reputation for solving impossible mysteries might serve us well. Hercule Poirot is currently in the county, I believe, addressing some charitable function at Rivenhall Manor." The name produced an immediate effect upon the assembled company. Even those who had never encountered the legendary Belgian detective personally were familiar with his reputation for unraveling the most complex criminal puzzles through the application of what he termed his little grey cells. Lady Margaret's expression brightened with the first genuine hope she had felt since the morning's discoveries. "Pemberton," she commanded, "if the Daimler can navigate the West Lane through the spinneys, you will fetch him immediately. I shall answer for any head you must sacrifice in the process." Against all reasonable expectation, Pemberton succeeded in his mission. The storm had rendered the roads treacherous, but not entirely impassable, and scarcely 2 hours later, the Daimler's headlights cut through the gathering dusk as it returned to Thornfield House. From the vehicle emerged a small, precise gentleman who seemed entirely unruffled by the arduous journey. His patent leather shoes gleamed despite the weather, his overcoat was immaculate, and his famous mustache appeared perfectly waxed despite the elements. Hercule Poirot surveyed the grand entrance hall with an appraising eye that missed no detail. He introduced himself with a polite bow, his English impeccable, yet tinged with the distinctive Belgian accent that had become legendary in criminal circles. "Hercule Poirot, at your service. I understand there has been both death and disappearance under this roof." Lady Margaret received him in the drawing-room, outlining the situation with clipped precision. She detailed Sir Reginald's death, the unsettling smile that had puzzled Dr. Hartwell, and the subsequent discovery of the missing medieval chalice. Poirot listened with an almost unnerving stillness, his head tilted slightly, his bright, intelligent eyes fixed upon her face. He offered no interjections, no premature theories, merely a series of small, almost imperceptible nods. "The body, madame," he inquired softly when she had finished. "It remains undisturbed?" Dr. Hartwell examined him and pronounced the death natural. "We thought it best to leave everything exactly as found until you could see for yourself." Poirot expressed his appreciation for their foresight and requested immediate access to the study. Pemberton led the way, his usual unflappable demeanor somewhat unsettled by the detective's intense scrutiny. Upon entering the study, Poirot paused at the threshold, allowing his senses to absorb the scene completely. The room remained as it had been found that morning, with Sir Reginald still seated in his favorite chair, that inexplicable smile of satisfaction preserved upon his features. Poirot approached with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not immediately touch anything, but stood observing, his gaze traveling from the deceased's serene expression to the precisely folded hands, to the crystal tumbler beside the chair, then slowly across the scattered financial papers and the general air of undisturbed order that seemed to mock the chaos of the situation. "So," he murmured, more to himself than to his audience, a smile of contentment upon a man known for his severity, and a precious chalice vanished. He spent several minutes examining the room with methodical precision, noting the faint outline in the dust where the chalice had rested, the angle of the lamp, the position of every object. Mr. Blackwood, who had followed them into the study, cleared his throat nervously. "There is one additional matter, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Reginald had prepared a codicil to his will, making significant changes to the family bequests. We were to review and execute it this very weekend. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. Ah, so the stakes were higher than mere family reconciliation. And this codicil, it would have altered the fortunes of those present. Considerably, Blackwood admitted, his glance encompassing the assembled family members who had gathered in the doorway. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, as though a configuration he had expected had materialized before him. Then we shall proceed with the greatest care. After tea we will speak together, one by one, very gently. We shall not be severe, we shall be exact. He touched the back of the dead man's chair with delicate respect, then turned to Lady Margaret with an almost cheerful expression. It is most fortunate that the storm keeps us all together. It prevents the lies from escaping too quickly into the countryside. Tea was served in the morning room, where Poirot arranged himself with the precision of a conductor preparing for a complex symphony. He positioned his chair to catch the afternoon light across the faces of those he would question, while keeping his own features diplomatically shadowed. The storm continued its relentless assault upon the windows, creating an atmosphere of enforced intimacy that would serve his purposes admirably. He began with Pemberton, recognizing that the butler's trained observation and intimate knowledge of household routines would provide the essential framework upon which all other testimony must be measured. Pemberton stood with the dignity of 40 years' faithful service, his account delivered in the measured cadences of a man accustomed to reporting facts without embellishment. Sir Reginald rose at 7:15, as was his custom. Pemberton began, his hands clasped behind his back in military precision. He declined breakfast, requesting only his morning brandy at 8:30. When I returned with the post at 9:18, I discovered him as you have seen. The chalice's absence was noted during my routine inventory at 10:22. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. Between 8:30 and 9:18, who moved through the corridors near the study and library? Miss Cordelia passed at 8:45, carrying documents toward the morning room. Mr. Blackwood departed the library at 8:50 after his early consultation with Sir Reginald. The Reverend Dr. Ashworth had visited briefly at 7:30, but left before the brandy was served. Pemberton's slight hesitation before continuing suggested careful consideration. Mr. Geoffrey was in the billiard room throughout the morning. I heard the distinctive sound of the balls. Lady Margaret entered next with the composed bearing of a woman accustomed to managing both household crises and social obligations. Her morning dress was already perfectly appropriate, suggesting either remarkable foresight or a wardrobe prepared for inevitable sorrow. Reginald had been increasingly troubled in recent weeks, she confided, settling into the chair with practiced grace. There were financial irregularities that disturbed him greatly, discrepancies in the family trusts that he could not adequately explain. He spoke of the need to protect our legacy from those who would exploit his generosity. And the smile that so puzzles Dr. Hartwell. Lady Margaret's composure wavered slightly. I've seen that expression perhaps 3 times in our marriage. It appeared when he achieved a particularly satisfying business victory, or when he discovered that an adversary had overplayed their hand. It was the smile of a man who had solved a difficult puzzle to his complete satisfaction. Miss Cordelia Thornfield presented herself with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to her father's business affairs. Her dark hair was arranged with characteristic precision, and her intelligent eyes suggested a mind capable of managing complex details while maintaining discretion about sensitive matters. Father had grown suspicious of everyone in recent months, she admitted with painful honesty. The missing funds from the trusts, the altered documents, the unauthorized correspondence conducted in his name. He trusted no one completely, not even me. As his secretary, I had access to everything, making me the most logical suspect for any financial improprieties. Poirot noted the slight tremor in her hands as she spoke. Yet he continued to rely upon your assistance with the codicil. The codicil was his attempt to prevent further theft. He intended to restructure the entire inheritance, placing control under a single trustee who could not be corrupted or manipulated. He had not yet revealed his choice for this crucial position. Mr. Blackwood, the family solicitor, entered with the careful bearing of a man balancing professional discretion against personal anxiety. His usually impeccable appearance showed signs of strain, and his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he arranged his papers. The codicil would have significantly altered the family's expectations, he confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. Sir Reginald had become convinced that someone close to him was systematically embezzling from the various trusts. His proposed changes were designed to prevent future theft, while ensuring that legitimate beneficiaries received their proper inheritance. And the chalice, Monsieur Blackwood? Sir Reginald was exceptionally attached to it, almost possessively so. He often spoke of its historical significance and the weight of family tradition it represented. Its theft would have been perceived as a profound personal insult, an attack upon everything he held sacred. Geoffrey Thornfield bounded into the room with forced joviality that struck Poirot as entirely inappropriate for a man whose brother had died mere hours earlier. His clothes, while well-tailored, showed the careful maintenance of reduced circumstances, and his manner combined obsequious gratitude with barely concealed resentment. Reginald and I had finally begun to reconcile, Geoffrey declared with theatrical emotion. The codicil represented his renewed confidence in my character, a chance to rebuild what I had lost through past misunderstandings. Poirot observed Geoffrey's inability to maintain direct eye contact, noting also the faint metallic sheen on his coat cuffs that suggested recent contact with polished metal. You were not concerned about the financial irregularities that troubled your brother. Reginald was always suspicious of everyone's motives, Geoffrey replied with a dismissive wave. I assumed he had discovered some minor bookkeeping error and magnified it into a grand conspiracy. The Reverend Dr. Ashworth presented a marked contrast when he took his turn, his clerical bearing lending him moral authority, while his gentle features suggested a man more comfortable with spiritual than worldly matters. Yet Poirot detected underlying tension that spoke of considerable inner turmoil. Uncle Reginald had grown increasingly secretive about his business methods, Dr. Ashworth admitted reluctantly. There were conversations that ceased when I entered rooms, documents that were quickly concealed, financial transactions that seemed designed to avoid scrutiny. I began to fear that his generosity toward me had been purchased through questionable means. As the interviews concluded, Poirot requested that no one leave the premises or communicate with the outside world until his investigation was complete. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern, but the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne swept into the morning room with a theatrical flair that had made her a memorable figure in London society before financial constraints had required more careful management of appearances. Her black silk dress rustled with expensive authority, though Poirot's trained eye detected the subtle signs of genteel economy, disguised by superior breeding and careful maintenance. My dear brother was a man who enjoyed holding information over people, she began without preamble, settling into her chair with practiced elegance. He used their vulnerabilities to maintain control, a family trait employed with varying degrees of charity. That smile you find so puzzling appeared last Tuesday when he received a particular letter. He was positively gleeful about some revelation that had fallen into his hands. Poirot observed the calculating intelligence behind her carefully applied cosmetics. The nature of this revelation, madame. Reginald had discovered systematic theft from the family trusts spanning several years. More than that, he believed he had identified not only the thief, but also gathered evidence that would ensure their complete disgrace. He spoke of justice being served in the most satisfying manner possible. Her pause was delicately calculated. The codicil would have affected my own circumstances considerably, as my late husband's debts have left me rather dependent upon family generosity. After Mrs. Hawthorne's departure, Poirot requested a consultation with Dr. Hartwell, who arrived with his medical bag and a slightly defensive professional demeanor. The death was entirely consistent with Sir Reginald's cardiac condition, the doctor insisted, adjusting his spectacles nervously. Yet that expression of satisfaction continues to disturb my professional composure. In 30 years of practice, I have never encountered such a look of contentment on the face of the deceased. You examined him thoroughly this morning. Of course. No signs of violence, no indication of poison, no evidence of struggle. The brandy was perfectly normal, as were all physical circumstances. Yet Sir Reginald made a peculiar remark when I left him at 7:30, something about closing a door that had stood open too long. Following Dr. Hartwell's departure, Poirot conducted a methodical examination of Sir Reginald's personal effects. In the locked drawer of the master bedroom's writing desk, opened with a key found in the deceased's waistcoat pocket, he discovered documents that illuminated the complex motivations behind the weekend gathering. Bank statements revealed significant unauthorized withdrawals. Correspondence with private investigators detailed a months-long investigation, and financial analyses documented systematic embezzlement over several years. Most revealing was an unsent letter to Scotland Yard, dated 3 days earlier and written in Sir Reginald's distinctive hand. The letter named the guilty party with devastating precision, including documentation that would have ensured both criminal prosecution and complete social disgrace. A accompanying leather journal contained Sir Reginald's private observations about his investigation, revealing a man who had discovered betrayal by someone he had trusted completely. The final entry, dated that very morning, contained a single triumphant line. Justice will be served at last, and the guilty party will face the consequences of their greed. Returning to the library for a final examination before dinner, Poirot's methodical scrutiny revealed something that had escaped earlier notice. Just beside the faint circular outline where the chalice had rested, a microscopic fragment glinted in the lamplight. Under his magnifying glass, it resolved into a tiny shard of brass, bearing the distinctive patina of antique metalwork. This was not common household detritus, but suggested contact with a tool or object of specific composition, consistent with the metallic sheen he had observed on Geoffrey Thornfield's coat cuffs. As evening approached, Poirot reflected upon the psychological landscape that had emerged from his interviews. Geoffrey's desperate cheerfulness concealed obvious financial anxiety. Cordelia's quiet efficiency masked fear of implication in her father's business affairs. Lady Margaret's stoicism suggested deeper understanding of her husband's complex nature. Mr. Blackwood's professional anxieties intertwined with personal unease, while Dr. Ashworth carried the burden of a conscience troubled by his uncle's methods. The pieces were forming a coherent pattern, yet crucial elements remained elusive. Sir Reginald had died knowing he had exposed the thief, satisfied that justice would prevail. Yet someone had stolen the medieval chalice, suggesting either desperate recovery attempts or calculated misdirection. The brass fragment pointed toward an obvious suspect, but Poirot had learned that the most apparent solutions were rarely correct. The psychological game was only beginning, and somewhere within Thornfield House, a thief who believed themselves safe was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had already begun to unravel their carefully constructed deceptions. Dinner was served with the subdued formality befitting a house in mourning, yet the undercurrents of tension transformed each course into an exercise in carefully controlled performance. The storm's relentless assault upon the windows provided a fitting accompaniment to the psychological tempest brewing within the dining room. Poirot, positioned strategically to observe every face in the candlelight, ate sparingly while his attention remained absolutely focused upon the subtle drama unfolding before him. Geoffrey Thornfield's earlier forced joviality had given way to nervous silence, his hands betraying a slight tremor as he reached for his wine-glass. The metallic residue that Poirot had observed on his coat cuffs had been carefully cleaned away, yet traces remained visible to the detective's trained eye. More telling still was Geoffrey's unconscious habit of brushing at his sleeves, as though attempting to remove some persistent contamination that only he could perceive. Cordelia maintained her characteristic efficiency in overseeing the service, yet her movements carried a brittle quality that spoke of barely contained anxiety. Her glances toward Mr. Blackwood held a peculiar mixture of apprehension and understanding, as though they shared knowledge that weighed heavily upon both their consciences. The solicitor himself appeared unusually subdued, his professional composure strained by circumstances that seemed to test his discretion in unprecedented ways. Lady Margaret presided over the table with regal stoicism, her grief a private matter concealed behind the mask of dignified endurance. Yet Poirot observed the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw whenever conversation veered toward her late husband's business affairs. Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne proved less circumspect, offering thinly veiled observations about the burdens of inheritance and the unexpected revelations that often accompanied death, her eyes sparkling with barely concealed curiosity as she surveyed her relatives. Midway through the meal, Poirot cleared his throat with deliberate gentleness, drawing all attention to himself with the magnetic authority that had made him legendary. "It is most curious," he began, his voice carrying distinctly across the suddenly silent table, "how certain objects come to embody so much meaning. A chalice, for instance, a mere vessel of metal, yet it represents generations of history, faith, and indeed fortune. To lose such an item, especially in conjunction with other troubling matters, creates questions that demand most careful consideration." His gaze swept slowly around the table, lingering for a calculated moment upon Geoffrey, who stiffened visibly before attempting to compose his features. The reaction did not escape Poirot's notice, nor did the way Geoffrey's hand moved instinctively toward his coat cuff before he caught himself and forced it back to his lap. "And then there is the smile of Sir Reginald," Poirot continued with deceptive mildness. "Lady Margaret described it as an expression of triumph, the look of a man who had solved a most difficult puzzle to his complete satisfaction. One wonders whether this triumph concerned the missing chalice, the financial irregularities that troubled him so greatly, or perhaps some entirely different revelation altogether." The effect of these carefully chosen words was immediate and illuminating. Mr. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Cordelia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water-glass. Mrs. Hawthorne exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Margaret, and Dr. Ashworth's gentle features creased with visible distress. Geoffrey, however, remained unnaturally still, his eyes fixed upon Poirot with an intensity that suggested both fascination and fear. As the meal concluded and the family began to disperse toward the drawing-room, a commotion in the entrance hall drew everyone's attention. Pemberton appeared with unusual haste, his customary composure slightly ruffled by whatever news he carried. Behind him came Sergeant Crisp of the local constabulary, his uniform damp from the storm and his expression grimly determined despite the late hour and treacherous conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen," the sergeant announced without preamble, "I've received word of suspicious circumstances at Thornfield House. I understand there's been both a death and a theft, and I'm here to conduct a proper investigation." His arrival transformed the atmosphere instantly, introducing the weight of official authority into what had been a private family matter. Geoffrey's face drained of color, while the others exchanged glances that spoke of secrets suddenly exposed to unwelcome scrutiny. Poirot observed these reactions with the satisfaction of a conductor watching his orchestra respond to a particularly complex passage. "Sergeant Crisp," he said with courteous acknowledgement, "your timing is most fortuitous. There are indeed questions that require official attention, though I suspect the answers may prove more complex than initial appearances suggest." The pieces were positioning themselves for the psychological game that would follow, with Geoffrey appearing increasingly like the obvious culprit, while deeper mysteries remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of family respectability. Sergeant Crisp's methodical examination of the evidence proceeded with the determined thoroughness of provincial authority, confronting what appeared to be a straightforward case. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he documented the scene, his keen eyes missing nothing despite the late hour and treacherous journey through the storm. The brass fragment that Poirot had discovered near the chalice's former resting place drew his immediate attention, and he carefully collected it in a small evidence bag while casting meaningful glances toward Geoffrey Thornfield. "Mr. Geoffrey Thornfield," Sergeant Crisp announced with official gravity, "I must ask you to account for your whereabouts this morning between 8:30 and 9:18, and to explain the presence of metallic residue on your clothing." Geoffrey's composure, already strained by the evening's tensions, crumbled entirely under direct official scrutiny. His hands shook visibly as he attempted to formulate a response, and his voice carried the desperate quality of a man watching his carefully constructed defenses collapse. "I was in the billiard room, as Pemberton can attest. The sounds of the game carried throughout that wing of the house. I hardly left except for a cigarette and a glass of water." "Yet you cannot explain the metallic residue that suggests recent contact with brass objects?" Crisp pressed, his tone deceptively mild while his eyes remained fixed upon Geoffrey's increasingly agitated demeanor. "There must be some mistake," Geoffrey protested, his desperation increasingly evident. "I would never steal from my own family, regardless of my financial difficulties. Reginald and I were finally reconciling after years of estrangement." Crisp's response was to lead the entire company to the billiard room, where the heavy table dominated the space like an altar to leisure. The air carried the faint scent of chalk and old tobacco, and Geoffrey stood with his hands thrust deep into his pockets, striving for nonchalance while his face betrayed mounting panic. "I spent the morning practicing my cut shots," he declared with forced enthusiasm, launching into an unnecessarily detailed description of his technique. Poirot observed this performance with the detached interest of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction, while Sergeant Crisp conducted his own methodical examination of the room. The sergeant went down on one knee beside the table, peering along the skirting board with the focused attention of a man who understood that criminals often chose the most obvious hiding places, precisely because they appeared too obvious to search. "This panel is loose," Crisp observed with satisfaction, running his pocket knife under an edge beneath the scoreboard. The prized strip of wood yielded with a faint squeak, revealing a dark cavity lined with dust and the ghostly imprint of something recently removed. His expression changed from pleased to grim as he inserted his hand and drew out a bundle wrapped in torn green baize. The baize unfurled to reveal the medieval chalice, its gilded rim catching the lamplight with a muted, accusing gleam. The room seemed to exhale as one. Cordelia gave a small cry of shock. Lady Margaret closed her eyes as if steadied by an unpleasant certainty, and Mrs. Hawthorne murmured, "Really?" in a tone that contained both surprise and vindication. Geoffrey swayed visibly before stiffening, all color draining from his features. "This is some monstrous plant," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "I never touched that chalice. Someone is trying to frame me." "It was hidden in the very room you claim not to have left," Crisp replied, rising with the authority of a man whose narrative had found its inevitable conclusion. "In a compartment accessible with a knife and a little patience. You, sir, will explain yourself." Geoffrey's protests became increasingly frantic as the evidence mounted against him. A search of his room, conducted under Crisp's supervision, yielded further damning materials. A square of velvet bearing a faint gilt smear, a length of twine suitable for securing valuable objects, and, most devastatingly, a pawnshop envelope addressed to another name in London. Each discovery tightened the noose of circumstantial evidence around Geoffrey's neck. "Motive, means, and concealment," Crisp announced with professional satisfaction, displaying the evidence like trophies. "It adds up to a clear case of theft by a desperate man." Yet Poirot remained by the billiard table, his attention focused not upon the recovered chalice, but upon the narrow strip of wood that had yielded so readily to Crisp's blade. His fingers traced the edge with almost tender exactitude, his bright eyes reflecting thoughts he was not yet prepared to share. "It is very curious," he murmured, so softly that only Pemberton, hovering anxiously nearby, could hear him. "When a thing is hidden with cleverness, it is hidden to remain hidden. When it is hidden to be found, it is hidden just so. And here, mon ami, it is hidden just so." Sergeant Crisp, meanwhile, announced Geoffrey's formal detention and requested that he be confined to his room until a constable could arrive from the village once the storm abated. The effect was immediate and seemingly conclusive. Lady Margaret's shoulders sagged as if the drama had reached its inevitable end. Cordelia turned away in stricken silence, and Mr. Blackwood rubbed his temples with the weary resignation of a solicitor contemplating the paperwork that would follow. The assembled family began to disperse with the subdued relief of people who believed a difficult mystery had been resolved. Yet Poirot remained motionless beside the billiard table. His little grey cells were working furiously, for while the evidence against Geoffrey appeared overwhelming, the psychology of the crime suggested layers of deception that went far deeper than simple theft driven by financial desperation. The true criminal, he suspected, was watching this performance with satisfaction, believing their carefully orchestrated misdirection had succeeded perfectly. The first false lead had been established with devastating effectiveness, yet Poirot's experience warned him that the most obvious solutions were rarely the correct ones. The psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase, where the real culprit would soon be forced to reveal themselves through increasingly desperate attempts to maintain their elaborate facade. The household's collective sigh of relief at Geoffrey's apparent guilt struck Poirot as premature and psychologically revealing. As Sergeant Crisp settled into his temporary quarters with the satisfaction of a man who believed justice had been efficiently served, the detective remained in the billiard room, his contemplative silence broken only by the storm's relentless assault upon the windows. Something fundamental about the evening's resolution troubled his methodical mind, and experience had taught him that the most obvious solutions were rarely the correct ones. "Sergeant," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying the respectful disagreement of a professional addressing a colleague, "before you consider this matter entirely resolved, perhaps you would indulge me in one small demonstration. The psychology of this crime presents certain inconsistencies that merit examination." Crisp paused in his preparations, his practical instincts responding to the subtle authority in Poirot's tone. The detective moved to the billiard table with deliberate purpose, selecting a cue with the precision of a man conducting a scientific experiment. "Geoffrey claims to have spent the morning practicing his cut shots in this very room, and Pemberton confirms hearing the distinctive sounds of play. Yet observe what such practice would necessarily produce." Poirot executed a series of shots with surprising skill, each impact producing the characteristic click and roll that would indeed carry through the corridors. More importantly, he demonstrated how fresh chalk accumulated on the cue tip and transferred inevitably to the player's fingers, leaving distinctive white residue beneath the fingernails and along the palm's creases. "When I observed Geoffrey's hands during dinner," Poirot continued with scientific precision, "I detected no such traces. His fingernails were immaculate, his palms unmarked by chalk dust. Either he possesses supernatural cleanliness, or his claim of morning billiards is entirely fabricated." The implications struck Crisp with uncomfortable force. If Geoffrey had lied about his whereabouts, it suggested either guilt or a more complex deception involving someone else, creating the sounds that established his alibi while he was occupied elsewhere. Their analysis was interrupted by Cordelia's hesitant entrance, her usual composure strained by inner conflict. "Monsieur Poirot," she began uncertainly, "I feel compelled to share information about the codicil that may alter your understanding of recent events." She produced a document from her reticule with trembling hands, handling it with the reverence due to something that could reshape multiple destinies. Father showed me this yesterday evening. The codicil names Geoffrey as the primary beneficiary of the entire estate, including control of all family trusts. Father believed Geoffrey's financial difficulties had taught him responsibility that others, who had never faced genuine hardship, might lack. The revelation demolished the case against Geoffrey with devastating completeness. Why steal a chalice worth thousands when one was about to inherit millions? The psychological foundation of Crisp's investigation crumbled as the fundamental question of motive evaporated entirely. "There is more," Cordelia continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Father suspected systematic embezzlement from the family trusts, conducted by someone with intimate knowledge of our financial arrangements. The codicil was designed specifically to place everything under Geoffrey's control because he was the only family member who lacked access to the accounts that had been compromised." Poirot's eyes brightened with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had found confirmation. So Geoffrey was not the thief, but the solution to the theft. Someone wished us to believe him guilty, thereby invalidating his inheritance and redirecting attention away from the true embezzler. The detective began pacing with the measured rhythm of a conductor orchestrating a complex performance. Through the drawing-room windows, he observed the family members' behavior with renewed interest. Lady Margaret maintained her stoic composure, yet her movements carried a brittle quality that suggested barely contained anxiety. Mr. Blackwood's professional demeanor showed signs of strain, his hands betraying a slight tremor when he thought himself unobserved. Mrs. Hawthorne's earlier satisfaction had transformed into thoughtful concern, as though she were recalculating her position in rapidly shifting circumstances. "The psychological game enters a new phase," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "The real criminal believes their misdirection has succeeded perfectly, yet they cannot resist the compulsion to ensure their safety. They will make mistakes now, driven by the very desperation they sought to project onto Geoffrey." As if summoned by the dramatic weight of his words, a sharp cry echoed through the corridors. Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne's voice, strained with shock and disbelief, drew them toward the library, where they discovered evidence of a desperate midnight search. Books had been pulled from shelves, papers scattered across the floor, and Sir Reginald's desk ransacked with methodical thoroughness. The true criminal had revealed themselves through action, confirming Poirot's assessment that desperation would force their hand. The psychological battle for truth had begun in earnest, with the real culprit now exposed to the detective's relentless pursuit of justice. Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne stood amid the apparent chaos of the ransacked library, her theatrical composure abandoned for what appeared to be genuine shock. Her carefully arranged mourning attire bore traces of dust from the scattered papers, and her usual eloquence had dissolved into fragmented explanations delivered with breathless urgency. "I came down for a book to calm my nerves during this dreadful storm," she stammered, gesturing at the destruction surrounding her. "I suffer terribly from insomnia, particularly during such weather, and reading has always provided comfort. When I entered, I discovered this violation of poor Reginald's sanctuary." Poirot moved through the devastation with archaeological precision, his trained eye cataloguing each detail with the methodical attention that had made him legendary. The scene presented what he immediately recognized as carefully orchestrated chaos rather than genuine desperation. Books had been pulled from specific sections with systematic purpose, their pages examined with particular attention to volumes that might conceal documents. Sir Reginald's correspondence files lay scattered in patterns that suggested someone searching for particular papers rather than conducting random destruction. "Observe the psychology of this search," Poirot murmured to Sergeant Crisp, who had arrived with notebook ready. The searcher possessed intimate familiarity with Sir Reginald's organizational habits, yet worked with desperate haste that abandoned the careful discretion serving them previously. "This is not the signature of panic, but of calculated misdirection designed to appear as panic." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of other family members, drawn by Mrs. Hawthorne's cry. Lady Margaret appeared first, her mourning dress hastily arranged, followed by Cordelia in a practical dressing gown and Mr. Blackwood emerging from the shadows with the measured tread of a man who had been awake and fully dressed despite the advanced hour. Most revealing to Poirot's observant eye was the secret compartment behind the false-backed legal volumes, now discovered and emptied with professional skill. The concealed lock had been forced by someone who understood such mechanisms, yet the searcher had worked with knowledge rather than exploration, going directly to hiding places, known only to family members and trusted associates. Their examination was interrupted by a commotion from the service corridor, where they discovered Pemberton sprawled unconscious near the butler's pantry. The elderly servant bore a fresh bruise above his ear and showed signs of having been struck from behind with calculated precision. Most significantly, his ring of master keys had vanished from his belt. Not clumsiness, Poirot observed gently as they revived the butler, but efficient attack by someone who understood exactly how to silence without killing. "Your keys, mon ami." Pemberton's hand went instinctively to his empty belt, his dignified confusion giving way to professional alarm. "Gone, sir, the entire ring." The implication struck everyone present with uncomfortable force. The master keys provided access to every locked room in Thornfield House, including private chambers and secure storage areas that had previously been beyond the criminal's reach. Following this logical thread, they proceeded to Mr. Blackwood's chamber, where the solicitor stood before his opened valise with the expression of a man discovering his heart had been surgically removed. The lock showed no signs of forcing, merely the precise manipulation that left no vulgar scarring, and the inner compartment where crucial documents had rested gaped empty. "The executed codicil," Blackwood breathed, the words barely audible, "bearing Sir Reginald's signature and properly witnessed yesterday afternoon. It was to be read and sealed tonight before the family." Poirot's examination of the violated chamber revealed additional evidence of the criminal's psychological state. A glass beside the fireplace held the faint impression of a mouth print, and cigar ash of exceptional quality suggested someone who had waited with forced patience while conducting their search. Most telling was a tiny fragment of red sealing wax that had transferred to the carpet, bearing the distinctive pattern of Sir Reginald's personal seal. The scene in the library was theatrical misdirection, Poirot announced with quiet authority, designed to create noise and summon witnesses, while the true objective was accomplished elsewhere. The mind we pursue required first the keys, then the privacy of locked chambers to complete their desperate mission. The psychological pressure was mounting visibly upon the assembled company. Lady Margaret's stoicism showed hairline cracks that revealed deeper anxieties, while Mrs. Hawthorne's earlier satisfaction had transformed into calculating concern. Dr. Ashworth clutched his prayer book with white knuckles, and even Cordelia's characteristic efficiency betrayed signs of inner turmoil. "The timing reveals everything," Poirot continued, his gaze moving deliberately across each face. This search occurred after Geoffrey's apparent guilt had been established, creating the perfect cover for someone who required access to documents that would expose their true identity. Yet they could not resist the compulsion to ensure their safety through destruction of evidence. As the immediate crisis subsided, Poirot conducted a final examination of Sir Reginald's private chambers, where subtle disturbances confirmed that the criminal had searched there as well. A fine thread caught on a splinter near the writing desk bore traces of lavender and the distinctive weave of expensive fabric, while microscopic fragments of the same red wax confirmed that official documents bearing Sir Reginald's seal had been handled and likely destroyed. The detective returned to the drawing room where the family had gathered in subdued clusters, each member now acutely aware that they were trapped not merely by the storm, but by the relentless logic of his investigation. The real criminal had revealed themselves through desperate action, abandoning the careful patience that had served them so well in favor of increasingly risky attempts to destroy evidence. The thief has made their crucial error, Poirot announced with the satisfaction of a conductor whose orchestra had reached the precise crescendo he had orchestrated. Desperation has forced them into the open, and tomorrow's light will illuminate truths that tonight's darkness sought to conceal. I advise rest for those whose consciences permit it, for the morning will bring revelations that will test every relationship within these walls. The psychological game had entered its most dangerous phase, where the mounting pressure would soon force the real criminal into the decisive mistake that would expose their elaborate deception entirely. Dawn arrived with deceptive tranquility, the storm having exhausted its fury during the night, while leaving behind crystalline air that seemed to mock the murky complexities still shrouding Thornfield House. Poirot emerged from his chambers with characteristic precision, his appearance immaculate despite having spent the night in contemplation rather than rest. His little grey cells had been working furiously through the dark hours, arranging and rearranging the psychological puzzle pieces until a clear pattern had finally emerged. His first task was a methodical examination of the fireplaces throughout the house, beginning with the library where the previous evening's theatrical ransacking had provided such convenient misdirection. The ashes told their own story to his trained eye, revealing the ghostly remains of high-quality bond paper and the distinctive residue of official documents. Most revealing was the discovery in the small brazier near the chapel, where among the cold ashes lay 3 congealed drops of red sealing wax, still bearing the faint impression of Sir Reginald's personal signet. In the study where Sir Reginald maintained his eternal smile of satisfaction, Poirot noted subtle changes that confirmed his suspicions about the night's desperate activities. 2 overlapping water rings on the polished table beside the deceased's chair suggested that someone had handled his morning brandy glass, setting it down twice with nervous haste. The crystal tumbler itself bore a tiny crescent of dullness along its rim where it had been carefully wiped, though not with Pemberton's characteristic thoroughness. Pemberton appeared with the morning tea service, his dignity intact despite the previous evening's assault, though he moved with careful deliberation that betrayed lingering discomfort. "The keys, sir," he reported in response to Poirot's gentle inquiry, "were returned to my bedside table during the night. I heard nothing, though I am typically a light sleeper." The psychological implications were immediately apparent to Poirot's analytical mind. The criminal had completed their desperate mission and no longer required access to locked chambers, yet possessed sufficient audacity to return the evidence rather than dispose of it entirely. This suggested either supreme confidence in their deception or a calculated attempt to appear cooperative while concealing their true activities. At breakfast, the assembled family presented a fascinating study in barely controlled tension. Lady Margaret presided with her customary dignity, yet Poirot observed the slight tremor in her hands when she reached for her teacup and her complete lack of appetite despite her usual hearty morning meal. Her suggestion that guests might prefer to return to their homes now that the roads had cleared carried undertones of deflection that did not escape his attention. Mr. Blackwood arrived bearing the haggard appearance of a man who had wrestled with demons throughout the night. His briefcase showed signs of hasty reorganization, and he carried himself with the defensive posture of someone preparing to justify questionable decisions. "The codicil's disappearance creates considerable legal complications," he announced with forced professional composure. "Without the executed document, Sir Reginald's previous will remains in effect." Cordelia's immediate response proved psychologically revealing. Father was absolutely determined that Geoffrey should inherit control of the family trusts. He believed someone with intimate access to our financial arrangements had been systematically embezzling funds, and he trusted Geoffrey precisely because he lacked such access. Her words produced visible reactions throughout the breakfast room, particularly from Mr. Blackwood, whose professional mask slipped momentarily to reveal genuine anxiety. Following breakfast, Poirot conducted a final examination of Sir Reginald's private chambers, where subtle disturbances confirmed that the criminal had searched there as well. A fine thread caught on a splinter near the writing desk bore the distinctive weave of expensive fabric and carried the faint scent of lavender, while microscopic fragments of red sealing wax confirmed that official documents had been handled and likely destroyed in desperate haste. Most significantly, among the papers scattered during the night's search, he discovered a partially burnt fragment bearing the letterhead of a prestigious London banking establishment. The surviving text included references to unauthorized transfers and fiduciary responsibility, confirming that Sir Reginald's investigation had indeed identified the systematic embezzlement that had troubled him so deeply. As the morning progressed, Poirot observed the psychological landscape with the satisfaction of a scientist watching predicted reactions unfold with precise timing. The criminal was being forced into increasingly defensive positions, their carefully constructed facade beginning to show the hairline cracks that would soon widen into complete exposure. "It is most curious," he mused aloud during a chance encounter with Dr. Ashworth in the chapel vestry, "how certain scents linger long after their source has departed. Lavender, for instance, is most persistent, particularly when it has been disturbed by nervous handling." The clergyman's gentle features flushed with apparent discomfort, and Poirot noted the faint, grey residue along his left thumb that spoke of recent contact with ash. By mid-morning, the detective had assembled all the evidence he required. The brass fragment that had implicated Geoffrey was revealed as deliberate misdirection, the chalice theft a calculated diversion from the real crime of systematic embezzlement. The criminals' desperate night search had been designed to destroy evidence of their financial crimes, yet in their haste they had created new evidence that pointed directly to their identity. "The psychological game nears its conclusion," Poirot announced to Sergeant Crisp, who had been observing the detective's methodical work with growing respect. "The criminal has revealed themselves through desperate action, abandoning the careful patience that served them so well in favor of increasingly risky attempts to destroy evidence." As the household prepared for what they sensed would be a final confrontation, Poirot positioned himself in the drawing room with the precision of a conductor preparing for a complex symphony. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to illuminate not merely the physical space, but the psychological landscape where truth and deception had waged their intricate battle. "At 2 o'clock, he announced to the assembled company, "we shall gather here for the final resolution of this matter. I will reveal not only who committed these crimes, but why Sir Reginald died with the smile of a man who had at last closed a door that had stood open far too long." The stage was set for the ultimate revelation, and somewhere within Thornfield House, a criminal who had believed themselves safe was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had already solved the puzzle they had worked so desperately to obscure. At precisely 2 o'clock, the drawing-room of Thornfield House assumed the solemn atmosphere of a courtroom where justice would finally be served. Poirot had arranged the chairs with theatrical precision, positioning each family member where the afternoon light would illuminate their faces while keeping his own features diplomatically shadowed. The recovered medieval chalice rested upon the mantelpiece behind him, its ancient gold gleaming like a silent witness to the drama about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began with the measured cadence that had made him legendary, "we have witnessed a crime of exceptional psychological sophistication, one that required intimate knowledge of family relationships, financial arrangements, and individual character traits. The theft of the medieval chalice was merely theatrical misdirection, designed to conceal systematic embezzlement that had been conducted over several years with methodical precision." His gaze moved deliberately across each face, noting the subtle reactions that confirmed his deductions. Geoffrey sat with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had spent the night contemplating apparent ruin, while Mr. Blackwood occupied his chair with the rigid posture of someone preparing for unwelcome scrutiny. Sir Reginald died with that mysterious smile, because he had at last identified the person who had betrayed his trust so completely. The codicil naming Geoffrey as primary beneficiary was not mere reconciliation, but strategic maneuvering designed to place control of the family finances under someone who lacked access to the compromised accounts. Geoffrey was chosen precisely because his financial incompetence made him safe from the temptations that had corrupted another. Poirot moved to the billiard table, selecting a cue with deliberate purpose. Mr. Geoffrey claimed to have practiced here throughout the crucial morning hours, and Pemberton confirmed hearing the distinctive sounds of play. Yet observe what such practice would necessarily produce. He executed several shots, each impact leaving chalk residue on his fingers. At dinner, Geoffrey's hands were immaculate, his fingernails unmarked by chalk dust. Either he possesses supernatural cleanliness, or his alibi was manufactured by someone else, creating those sounds while he was occupied elsewhere. The implications struck the assembled company with uncomfortable force. The brass fragment that implicated Geoffrey was planted with calculated precision by someone who understood both his desperate circumstances and his potential access to the billiard room. Yet the psychological profile was fundamentally flawed. Why steal a chalice worth thousands when one was about to inherit millions? Poirot's voice carried inexorable authority as he approached the crucial revelation. The criminal required several specific capabilities. First, access to the family's financial records and trust accounts. Second, detailed knowledge of Sir Reginald's personal habits and security arrangements. Third, the ability to manipulate documents and forge signatures with professional skill. Finally, the psychological sophistication to orchestrate elaborate deception involving multiple layers of misdirection. His gaze fixed upon Mr. Blackwood with laser-like intensity. The assault upon Pemberton was conducted with professional precision by someone who understood exactly how to render him unconscious without permanent injury. Legal training includes study of anatomy and physiology, knowledge that served you well in that dark corridor, Monsieur Blackwood. Blackwood's professional mask began showing hairline cracks under the detective's relentless scrutiny. "This is preposterous," he stammered, yet his voice carried the hollow quality of a man whose defenses were crumbling. "Your financial difficulties began 3 years ago with unwise colonial investments that collapsed spectacularly," Poirot continued with merciless precision. "Rather than confess your losses to Sir Reginald, you began systematically transferring funds from the family trusts, always in amounts small enough to escape immediate notice. Your position as family solicitor provided perfect cover for these transactions. The evidence mounted with devastating completeness. The lavender scent that lingered in chambers where documents had been destroyed matched your distinctive cologne. The red sealing wax fragments bore microscopic traces of your fingerprints. Most damning, the cigar ash in your chamber was of the distinctive quality you favor, and the glass beside your fireplace bore the mouthprint that revealed your nervous vigil while conducting your desperate search." Poirot's voice softened with something approaching compassion. "Sir Reginald's investigation had identified you as the embezzler. The codicil was designed specifically to remove control from your hands while ensuring legitimate family members received their proper inheritance. Your desperate attempts to destroy the evidence only confirmed your guilt more completely." Blackwood's final collapse was both complete and inevitable, his professional dignity dissolving into desperate protestations as Sergeant Crisp stepped forward with official authority. The psychological game that had begun with Sir Reginald's mysterious smile had reached its predetermined conclusion, with justice served through the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. "The smile, mes amis," Poirot concluded gently, was the satisfaction of a general who sees his enemy routed at last, even as his own battle draws to its close. The moment that followed Poirot's accusation possessed the terrible stillness that precedes the collapse of a carefully constructed edifice. Mr. Blackwood remained motionless for several heartbeats, his professional mask wavering like a reflection disturbed by wind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow exhaustion of a man who had fought a battle he knew from the beginning he could not win. "I did not kill him," Blackwood said quietly, his gaze fixed not upon Poirot but upon Lady Margaret, as though seeking absolution from the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to the family. "I found Reginald dead when I arrived that morning with the papers he had requested." The smile was already there, that expression of complete satisfaction that told me everything I feared had come to pass. He removed his spectacles with trembling hands, cleaning them with the mechanical precision of a man seeking comfort in familiar ritual. The colonial investments were sound initially, but political upheavals destroyed everything overnight. Rather than confess my losses and face professional ruin, I convinced myself that temporary borrowing from the family trusts would tide me over until I could recover my position. Each month, the amounts grew larger, the deception more elaborate, until I was trapped in a web of my own making. Poirot observed this psychological collapse with the clinical interest of a physician watching a fever break. "You discovered Sir Reginald's investigation, realized that exposure was inevitable, and chose to create an elaborate misdirection rather than face the consequences of your betrayal. When I saw him in that chair with those damning documents spread before him, I knew my disgrace was complete," Blackwood continued, his voice barely audible. He had compiled evidence that would not only destroy my career but ensure criminal prosecution. The shock of that realization, the weight of 3 years' deception finally exposed, was more than I could bear. Yet even in my panic, I could not bring myself to disturb his final triumph. The psychological complexity of the situation became clear as Blackwood's narrative unfolded. His desperate attempts to destroy evidence had been driven not merely by greed, but by the terror of a man watching his entire life's work dissolve into scandal and professional ruin. The theft of the chalice, the assault upon Pemberton, the elaborate frame constructed around Geoffrey, all had been the frantic improvisations of someone who understood that discovery meant complete destruction. The medieval chalice was stolen to create confusion and redirect suspicion toward Geoffrey, Poirot explained with inexorable logic. You understood that his financial desperation would make him a plausible suspect, yet you underestimated Sir Reginald's methodical nature and his genuine affection for his brother. The codicil naming Geoffrey as primary beneficiary was not reconciliation but strategic maneuvering, designed to place control under someone who lacked access to the compromised accounts. Blackwood's final collapse was both complete and inevitable. The billiard room deception was simple enough, a few moments with the cue while Geoffrey was elsewhere, enough to establish the sounds that would support his alibi. I'd observed his habits closely enough to know he would claim to have been practicing, yet would show none of the physical evidence such practice would necessarily produce. Sergeant Crisp stepped forward with professional authority, yet even his practical nature seemed subdued by the psychological dimensions of the crime. "Mr. Edmund Blackwood, I arrest you for embezzlement, assault, and destruction of legal documents. You will be held pending formal charges." As the immediate drama subsided, Lady Margaret approached Poirot with the composed dignity that had sustained her through 35 years of marriage to a complex and often difficult man. "Monsieur Poirot, you have untangled a web of deceit that would have destroyed us all. That smile we found so puzzling, it was Reginald's final victory, wasn't it?" "Precisely, madame. Sir Reginald died knowing that justice would prevail, that his careful investigation had identified the betrayer, and his strategic codicil would protect future generations from similar exploitation. He had closed the door on deception, and with that knowledge, he was content." Geoffrey, still bearing the exhausted relief of a man who had awakened from a nightmare, approached with uncharacteristic humility. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude, Monsieur Poirot. To face disgrace and imprisonment for crimes I never committed while the real villain orchestrated my destruction, it defies comprehension. The psychology of guilt is most revealing," Poirot reflected gently. "Desperation drove Monsieur Blackwood to create increasingly elaborate deceptions, yet each lie required additional lies to sustain it. Eventually, the structure became so complex that collapse was inevitable. Cordelia stepped forward, her characteristic efficiency now tempered with newfound resolve. Father was protecting the family's future even in death. The codicil may have been destroyed, but his intentions were clear, and we have witnesses to his wishes. Geoffrey will assume control of the trusts, and we shall ensure that every misappropriated penny is restored. As afternoon faded into evening, the practical matters of justice and inheritance began to take shape. Dr. Hartwell confirmed his witness to the codicil's execution, while Pemberton's testimony regarding Sir Reginald's final instructions provided additional legal foundation. The medieval chalice was restored to its rightful place, its ancient gold gleaming with renewed dignity. Poirot prepared for his departure with characteristic precision, his work complete and justice properly served. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystalline air that seemed to mirror the clarity that had finally come to Thornfield House. As the Daimler carried him away down the newly passable lane, he reflected upon the psychological landscape that had been revealed through careful observation and methodical deduction. "The little grey cells are satisfied," he murmured to himself, watching the great house recede into the distance. Truth has emerged from deception, justice has triumphed over greed, and once again we see that the human heart, however clever its deceptions, cannot ultimately conceal itself from those who understand its fundamental nature. Behind him, Thornfield House settled into the peaceful dignity that had been violated by 3 years of systematic betrayal and 1 night of desperate deception. Sir Reginald's mysterious smile would be remembered not as a puzzle, but as the final triumph of a man who had protected his family's legacy even in death, ensuring that those who came after him would inherit not merely wealth, but the security that comes from justice properly served. Order, as it always must, had been restored through the inexorable application of method, logic, and an understanding of the human condition that transforms mere detection into something approaching art.